At our wedding, someone passed me a note with no name. Your husband spent last night with me. I crumpled it in my hands and smiled all evening. The next morning, when he discovered that all his accounts were frozen, and on the table lay, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." People always say your wedding day is the happiest day of your life. And standing in that ballroom at the Palmer House Hotel in downtown Chicago, in a dress that had taken me 4 months to choose, surrounded by 200 people who loved us, I believed it. I genuinely believed it. My name is Elizabeth Hart, Liz, to everyone who knows me. I was 34 years old on the day I married Daniel Hart, and I thought I knew exactly who I was marrying. Daniel and I had met 6 years earlier at a rooftop fundraiser for a local architecture nonprofit. He was tall, easy with his smile, the kind of man who made a room feel warmer just by being in it. I was a financial analyst at a mid-size investment firm on the Loop, careful with numbers and careful with people. We balanced each other, or so I thought. He dreamed in blueprints, I thought in spreadsheets. He cooked on Sunday mornings and left the dishes for Monday. I filed my taxes in January. We were different, but we fit. Or at least I had spent 6 years convincing myself we did. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that I chose not to examine too closely. There were little things, the kind that feel insignificant in isolation, but form a pattern when you finally allow yourself to look at the whole picture. The nights Daniel came home late from the office and smelled faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine. The way his phone screen always tilted away from me when a message arrived. The weekend conference in Milwaukee 8 months before our wedding, the one I had been invited to join before he, quietly and gently, talked me out of coming. You'd be bored, Liz. It's 3 days of zoning variances and municipal codes. And I had laughed and stayed home and reorganized our kitchen cabinets. I told myself these were the reasonable anxieties of a woman on the edge of a major life decision. Pre-wedding nerves dressed up as suspicion. Every therapist I'd ever read said it was normal to question things before commitment. So I smoothed the doubts down and kept moving forward. Because the alternative, actually pulling at those threads, felt more frightening than anything I had imagined. Then came the wedding day itself. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. By 7, we were an hour into the reception, and Daniel was laughing with his groomsmen near the bar, looking genuinely happy in the way that had always disarmed me. I was at the sweetheart table speaking to my college roommate Dana when one of the catering staff appeared at my elbow, a young woman, 19 or 20, with an uncertain expression. "Mrs. Hart," she said. "Someone asked me to give you this." She handed me a small square of folded paper, the kind torn from a notepad, ordinary and white, and disappeared back into the crowd before I could ask her anything. I remember the noise of the room, the jazz quartet playing Sinatra, the smell of gardenias from the centerpieces. I unfolded the note. Your husband spent last night with me. No name, no number. No further explanation. Just those 7 words in a tight, deliberate handwriting I didn't recognize. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully, creased it exactly along its original lines, and tucked it into the small satin clutch on the table beside me. I looked up at Dana, who was mid-sentence about her sister's new apartment in Boston, and I smiled. I smiled for the rest of the evening. I danced with Daniel to Etta James. I cut the cake. I thanked 200 people for coming to celebrate our love, and the entire time, something cold and quiet was moving through me. Not panic, not tears, but something more like a door closing very slowly and very firmly in a room I had always kept open. I did not cry that night. I lay beside Daniel in the bridal suite on the 22nd floor, listening to him breathe as he slept, And I stared at the ceiling and I thought, who wrote that note? And why? But more than that, I thought something else. Something that surprised me with its clarity. What do I actually know about the man sleeping next to me? That was the first night of my marriage. And it was the night everything I thought I had built began, very quietly, to come apart. We flew to Costa Rica the next morning for our honeymoon. 14 days at a private villa outside Manuel Antonio, the kind of trip Daniel had planned for months and presented to me like a gift. Printed itinerary, reservations at restaurants I had mentioned once in passing, a sunrise kayaking tour he'd booked because he remembered I'd said, years ago, that I wanted to see bioluminescent water before I turned 40. I went through all of it. I kayaked. I ate grilled fish on terraces above the Pacific. I swam in a private pool while toucans moved through the trees overhead, and I smiled because I had made a decision on that ceiling in the bridal suite. I would not confront Daniel yet, not without knowing more, not without something real in my hands. The note could have been nothing. A cruel joke from someone at the wedding. A bitter ex-girlfriend playing a tired game. Daniel had dated before me. Of course he had. There were women in his past who had not been happy when he moved on. I was a financial analyst. I dealt in evidence and probability every day. And the probability that a single anonymous note represented the full truth of a 6-year relationship seemed, in the rational part of my brain, genuinely low. But the rational part of my brain had also noticed things over those 14 days that it quietly filed away. The way Daniel's phone never left his body. The 2 times he stepped outside the villa to take a call and came back slightly too relaxed, like a man who has successfully managed something. The night on day 9 when he was distant, in a way he covered with wine and compliments. None of it was conclusive. All of it was data. We came home to Chicago on a Thursday. We came home to our shared apartment in Lincoln Park, the one we had been renting together for 2 years, with the exposed brick wall in the living room and the kitchen that looked out over a courtyard with an oak tree. We came home to the life we had built. And that Friday morning, while Daniel was in the shower, I sat at our kitchen table with my coffee, and I took stock. What did I actually have? One anonymous note, a collection of behavioral observations that could be explained away individually. A marriage that was, legally, 11 days old. What did I stand to lose if I was wrong? My husband. My home. The future we had discussed in detail. Children in 2 years. A house on the North Shore eventually, his mother's Thanksgiving, and my family's Christmas. 6 years of shared history. What did I stand to lose if I was right and did nothing? That question sat with me longer than I expected, because the answer was not just emotional. I was a financial analyst. I understood how money worked in a marriage, and I had been the primary earner for the last 3 years of our relationship. When we married, we had begun the process of merging finances, a joint account for household expenses, shared access to certain investment portfolios. Daniel had recently become a signatory on several accounts I had built over a decade. If Daniel had been unfaithful before we were even married, if this was a pattern, not an incident, then I was sitting inside a legal and financial structure that had been built on a foundation I had never actually inspected. The fear that moved through me then was different from the cold quiet of the wedding night. This was sharper. This was the kind of fear that makes your hands go still on the coffee cup and makes you look at the room around you. The oak tree, the brick wall, the life you assembled piece by piece, and wonder how much of it was real. But I had built my career on one principle. Fear is information, not instruction. Fear tells you the stakes. It doesn't tell you to run, it tells you to think. So I thought. By the time Daniel came out of the shower and kissed the top of my head and asked if I wanted to walk to the farmer's market on Green Bay, I had already decided 3 things. First, I needed to know who sent that note. Second, I needed to quietly protect my finances before doing anything visible. Third, I needed a lawyer, not to file anything yet, but to understand exactly where I stood legally 11 days into a marriage I might need to exit. I smiled up at him and said yes to the farmer's market. I bought heirloom tomatoes and sourdough bread, and I held his hand on the walk back. And in my head, very quietly and very methodically, I began to make a list. That was the beginning. Not a dramatic beginning. No shouting, no accusations, no tears in the kitchen. Just a woman at a table with a coffee cup, deciding that she was not going to be the person things happened to. She was going to be the person who found out the truth. The first call I made was to my older sister, Rachel, who was a family law attorney in Evanston. I did not call her as a sister. I called her as a client. We met for lunch at a small Italian place on Davis Street, far enough from Lincoln Park that no one we knew would walk by. Rachel was 57 minutes late because she had a custody hearing that ran long, and when she finally sat down across from me, she looked at my face and did not say anything warm or sympathetic. She said, "How long have you known?" That was Rachel, straight through the bone. I told her everything. The note, the behavioral observations during the honeymoon, the financial structure of the marriage as it currently stood. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she said, 11 days. That's actually very clean from a legal standpoint, Liz. The marriage is short enough that asset division will be relatively straightforward if you move quickly. She told me exactly what to do. Open an individual savings account in my name only at a different bank from our shared accounts. Begin transferring a portion of my direct deposits there. Not all at once, not enough to trigger obvious alarm, but steadily. Document every joint expense from this point forward. Make no large purchases without a record. And most importantly, do not confront Daniel until I had something concrete. You need evidence, she said, not suspicion. Courts don't care about feelings, Liz. They care about documentation. I had the new account open before I went back to work that afternoon. The second step was more difficult. I needed to know who wrote the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper was ordinary, but whoever had sent it knew where we were getting married, had access to the reception, and had enough information about Daniel's whereabouts the night before the wedding to make a specific claim. The night before the wedding, Daniel had stayed at the Marriott River North with his groomsmen, a bachelor-adjacent tradition. Not a formal bachelor party, just the groomsmen gathering the night before so they wouldn't have to deal with morning logistics from different parts of the city. I had stayed with Dana and 2 of my bridesmaids at my mother's house in Oak Park. I started with the groomsmen. There were 4 of them. Marcus, his college roommate, Pete, his oldest friend from high school, Jake, a colleague from his architecture firm, and Rory, a cousin who had flown in from Denver. I knew Marcus and Pete well. Jake and Rory, I knew less. Over the following 2 weeks, I was careful. I reached out to people naturally, in the way a new bride might, organizing photos, planning thank you notes, suggesting a group dinner to celebrate. I paid attention to what people said, and more importantly, to what they didn't say. It was Dana who gave me the first real thread, not intentionally. We were having dinner at her apartment in Wicker Park when she said, casually, that she had seen Daniel's colleague, the one from his firm, the young one, at the reception, and that she had seemed oddly intense for someone who was just a coworker. "Which colleague?" I asked. "I don't know her name." "Tall, dark hair, red dress. She was watching you during the first dance." I went home that night and looked through the photographs from the reception. We had a professional photographer, and the proofs had just arrived online. It took me 40 minutes of searching before I found her. In the background of a wide shot of the dance floor, near the edge of the frame, a woman in a red dress, standing slightly apart from the crowd, her face turned toward the sweetheart table where Daniel and I had been sitting. Her eyes were not on Daniel, they were on me. I took a screenshot. I cross-referenced the guest list. She wasn't on it. She had come without an invitation, or she had come with someone who had one. I went to the website of Daniel's firm, Renner and Cole Architecture, and I scrolled through the staff page until I found her. Kristen Vaughn. Associate architect, 29 years old. She had joined the firm 14 months ago. I looked at her professional photo for a long time. She was objectively attractive in the way that I registered factually, not emotionally. Dark hair, direct eyes, the kind of composed expression that people practice. And then I opened my email and sent an inquiry to a private investigator my firm had used twice for due diligence on potential partners. His name was Gary Feldman. He was thorough, discreet, and expensive. I met Gary at his office in the West Loop on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, 6 weeks after my wedding. I told him what I needed: a factual account of Daniel's whereabouts on the night before the wedding, and a clear picture of his relationship with Kristen Vaughn. What Gary delivered 3 weeks later was a folder that changed everything. He had interviewed a bellman at the Marriott River North, off the record, willing to talk, who remembered the bachelor group on the 8th floor and remembered that one of the men had a guest arrive late and leave early. He had obtained hotel records through channels I didn't ask about. He had documented 11 instances, with timestamps and parking garage footage, of Daniel and Kristen meeting outside office hours over a period of 14 months. 14 months. That took it back to before Daniel had proposed. I sat in Gary's office with the folder in my hands, and I felt, for the first time since the wedding, something that wasn't cold. It was a very specific kind of grief. The kind you feel not when you lose something, but when you realize something was never there to begin with. I drove home. I put the folder in the fireproof safe in the back of my closet. I made dinner. I sat across from Daniel at our kitchen table while he talked about a project deadline, and I listened and nodded, and I said almost nothing. Because now I had evidence, and evidence changes everything. The plan moved in 3 parts, and I had timed each one carefully. Part 1 was financial. Over the 6 weeks since the wedding, I had already shifted a significant portion of my liquid assets into my individual account, methodically, within legal limits, without triggering any automatic alerts. Now I moved into the second phase. I contacted the investment firm that managed my largest portfolio, my pre-marital retirement account, and had it legally redesignated under a sole ownership trust in my name. Rachel had drafted the documents. Everything was above board. Everything was documented. And because I understood financial structures the way other people understand traffic patterns, I knew exactly which threads I could pull without disturbing the surface. Part 2 was legal. Rachel filed a petition for annulment on the grounds of fraud, specifically that Daniel had misrepresented fundamental facts about his fidelity prior to and at the time of the marriage ceremony. An annulment, unlike a divorce, treats the marriage as though it did not legally exist. It requires a higher burden of proof, but I had Gary's folder. Rachel was confident. She said we had enough. Part 3 was the accounts. On a Wednesday morning in late October, exactly 3 months and 4 days after the wedding, the joint accounts were frozen pending legal review, and the cards attached to them were suspended. I had arranged this with my bank the previous afternoon, acting on Rachel's instruction, citing suspected unauthorized financial activity. It was legal, it was proper, and it was surgical. I was in my office on the 14th floor of my firm when Daniel's first call came in. I sent it to voicemail. The second call came 12 minutes later. I sent that one too. His text read, "Liz, something is wrong with the accounts. Can you call me?" I replied, "I know. My attorney will be in touch." There was a long pause. Then, "Your attorney? What's going on?" I set the phone face down on my desk and kept working. But that evening, when I arrived at our apartment, I understood that Kristen Vaughn was not a passive player in this situation. She had known I was married to Daniel. She had been at my wedding reception, uninvited. She had sent the note herself. I was now certain of it, and Gary had confirmed it through a handwriting comparison against a sample he obtained from her professional licensing documents. She had sent that note not to warn me. She had sent it to provoke me, or to frighten me, or perhaps to feel some measure of power over a situation she had created. People who conduct affairs develop complicated internal justifications. Sometimes they cast themselves as the honest one. I found that out more directly than I expected. She called my cell phone at 8:15 that evening. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. "I think we should talk," Kristen said. Her voice was measured and almost friendly, which told me she had prepared for this call. "About what?" I asked. "About what you're doing, and what you should consider before you go any further." There it was. Not an apology. A warning. I kept my voice completely even. "I'm listening." What followed was a 10-minute conversation that I recorded, legally, in Illinois with one-party consent, in which Kristen Vaughn told me, in careful and graduated language, that if I continued to pursue legal action, she would make certain information available about my financial dealings at my firm. She had, she said, access to communications between me and a former client that could raise questions. I knew immediately what she meant. 2 years ago, I had advised a client on a restructuring that had since come under informal review by our compliance department. Nothing had come of it, nothing would, because I had done nothing wrong. But it was the kind of ambiguous situation that could be made to look complicated by someone who knew how to frame things. She had done research. She had found the one thing that might make me hesitate. I let her finish. Then I said, "Kristen, I want you to know that this conversation has been recorded. The threat you just made constitutes extortion under Illinois law. I would recommend speaking to your own attorney before doing anything else." The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then she ended the call. Daniel appeared at the apartment 2 hours later. His key still worked. We were still technically married. And what followed was the first real conversation we had since the wedding. He was not cruel. He was not violent. He sat in the kitchen where I had made my list 11 weeks earlier, and he said he was sorry, and he asked if we could find a way through this, and he looked genuinely miserable in the way that people look when consequences arrive. I told him my attorney's name and said all further communication should go through her. He left. I locked the door. I poured 2 inches of bourbon into a glass, and I sat on the couch in the living room with the oak tree outside the window, and I did not cry. I was steady. But I was also, underneath the steadiness, deeply tired. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. I booked 3 days off work the following week. I went to my mother's house in Oak Park, slept in my childhood bedroom, and let her feed me soup and ask me almost nothing. Rachel came over on the second night, and we sat on the porch, and she told me I had done everything right. "The hard part is mostly done," she said. I nodded, but I knew it wasn't, because people who are losing rarely accept that quietly, and Kristen Vaughn did not strike me as someone who accepted things quietly. The attempt at seduction, and I don't mean that romantically, came from Daniel, and it came in the form of a letter, not a text, not an email. A handwritten letter delivered to my office building through a courier service, addressed to me personally. and marked personal and confidential. His handwriting was the careful architectural print he'd had since college, the kind that looked designed rather than written. 6 pages. I sat at my desk on the 38th day after I had told him to communicate through Rachel, and I read all 6 pages. It was, I will admit, a well-constructed letter. Daniel was intelligent, and he knew me well enough to know what arguments would land. He didn't minimize. He didn't offer excuses. He described the affair. It had begun, he wrote, during a vulnerable period in our relationship, a stretch of 4 months when I was working 70-hour weeks on a major merger, and we had seen each other, he felt, more as roommates than partners. He said he had ended it before the engagement. He said the night before the wedding had been a mistake made out of weakness, a goodbye that should never have happened. He said he had loved me throughout, which was not a contradiction he was asking me to resolve, only to know. He asked for mediation, not to cancel the annulment proceedings, he said, but simply to speak, with a neutral party present. He said he was not asking me to stay. He was asking me to hear him. I read the letter twice. I held it in my hands, and I felt the particular pull of it. Not because I still loved Daniel in the way I once had, but because 6 years of shared life creates a gravity that is very hard to simply walk away from. He knew my language. He knew which words would find the soft places. I put the letter in the fireproof safe with Gary's folder. Then I made a list of what I knew to be true, separate from what I felt. I knew that the affair had lasted 14 months. Not 4 months, 14. His timeline in the letter was revised. I knew this because Gary's documentation was time-stamped, and Kristen's parking records from the building where Daniel's firm held a satellite office went back to the month he claimed the affair had not yet started. He had reframed the timeline to make himself more sympathetic. It was subtle, and it was deliberate, and it told me everything I needed to know about whether reconciliation was possible. A man who edits the truth in his apology has not stopped editing the truth. I wrote Daniel a reply. 1 sentence, typed, printed, mailed through Rachel's office. All further communication through counsel. Kristen, meanwhile, was quieter. Gary told me she had consulted an attorney of her own shortly after our phone call, a reasonable response to my mention of extortion. Her attorney had, presumably, told her to stop contact. The call she had made to my phone remained on the recording, and I had transmitted a copy to Rachel and kept the original. Kristen's silence was not peace. It was calculation. I understood that distinction very clearly. What I needed in that stretch of weeks was not strategy. I had plenty of strategy. What I needed was people. My mother was steady in the way that mothers who have survived difficult marriages tend to be steady. Not falsely cheerful, not fragile, just present. She made coffee and did not offer opinions unless asked, and when she did offer opinions, they were brief and accurate. Dana was more useful in a different way. She had been through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier, and she had come out of it with the specific knowledge that only experience provides. We started meeting every Thursday evening at her apartment in Wicker Park. We cooked dinner together, and she talked about what the process had looked like from the inside. The small bureaucratic humiliations, the way time moved strangely during legal proceedings, the importance of having at least one commitment each week that had nothing to do with any of it. She also, on the 4th Thursday, introduced me to her friend Carol, a therapist who had worked extensively with women navigating high-conflict separations. I started weekly sessions the following Monday. Carol did not tell me what to feel or what to do. She asked questions that I had not thought to ask myself, about what I wanted the next 5 years to look like, about who I had been before Daniel, and who I intended to be after. She made me examine the parts of the relationship I had idealized, not to make me feel foolish, but to give me an accurate picture to work from. "You can't grieve something accurately if you don't see it accurately," she said in one of our early sessions. I thought about that a great deal. By the end of November, 3.5 months into the annulment process, I had rebuilt something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but a sense of orientation. I knew which direction I was facing, and I trusted the ground under my feet, and those two things turned out to be more sustaining than I would have expected. I was ready for whatever came next, which was fortunate, because what came next arrived on my doorstep on a Tuesday evening with a bottle of wine and a face full of carefully arranged regret. They came together, which surprised me. I had not expected that. Daniel and Kristen presenting themselves as a unified front at my front door on a Tuesday in early December, 4 months into the annulment proceedings. I had not expected the bottle of Burgundy Daniel was holding, or the way Kristen stood half a step behind him with an expression she had clearly practiced, something positioned between remorse and quiet dignity. I had not expected them to be a them so openly, so quickly, but I thought about it later, and I understood. Separate approaches had failed. The letter from Daniel, the threat from Kristen, both had met silence or legal reply. Together, they had apparently decided they might be more convincing or more intimidating. It was hard to know which they intended, and perhaps they intended both. I let them in, not out of weakness, out of the understanding that what a person says when they believe they're winning tells you a great deal more than what they say when they're losing. We sat in the living room, the three of us, with the oak tree visible through the window. I had turned the heating up earlier that evening, which meant the room was comfortable and slightly too warm, the kind of room that makes people relax their guard. I sat in the armchair. I offered them nothing. I waited. Daniel opened. He was composed, and his approach had shifted since the letter. He was no longer apologetic. He was, and this was the tell, reasonable. He spoke in the language of mutual benefit, of avoiding prolonged legal costs, of protecting both our professional reputations from what he called the collateral damage of contested proceedings. He said the annulment on grounds of fraud was aggressive and would be difficult to sustain in court. He said Rachel's strategy was designed to maximize conflict, not resolve it. He suggested a mediated settlement, quiet, quick, and fair. Fair, I repeated. I kept my voice completely neutral. Fair, he said. Equitable. No one wins in court, Liz. Not really. Then Kristen spoke. And this was, I think, where the real message lived. She was measured, and she was careful. But underneath the careful words was a structure I recognized from the phone call 4 months earlier. She spoke about her own position at Daniel's firm, about the awkwardness that the ongoing proceedings were causing professionally, and then she said something that was not quite a threat, but was built in the same shape as one. That she had been speaking to a journalist at a financial publication, a contact from her graduate program, who had expressed interest in stories about ethical ambiguities in mid-size investment firms. She let that sit for a moment. Then she added, very smoothly, that she, of course, had no intention of sharing anything, that she simply wanted all of us to be able to move forward cleanly. There it was. The same compliance review ambiguity she had raised in the October phone call, now dressed in nicer clothes and accompanied by a bottle of wine. They had come to my home together, to remind me what I stood to lose and to offer me the choice to make it all go away quietly. I looked at them both for a long moment. The room was warm. The oak tree was bare in December. I thought about Carol's question. Who do you intend to be after this? I appreciate you both coming, I said. I want to make sure I understand what you're offering. You'd like me to withdraw the annulment petition and agree to a quiet settlement, in exchange for the understanding that certain information about my professional history will remain private. Daniel started to say that wasn't exactly— That's extortion, I said. Again. And this time, unlike the October phone call, there are two of you present, which makes it conspiracy to commit extortion under Illinois law. I reached to the side table beside my armchair and picked up my phone. I've been recording this conversation since you sat down. One-party consent. Everything you've said in the last 23 minutes is documented. Kristen's face did something complicated. The practiced expression came apart, briefly, and what replaced it was something rawer. Anger, and underneath the anger, something close to fear. Daniel stood up. Liz, Rachel will be sending your attorney a motion tomorrow morning, I said. I'd recommend you both speak to counsel tonight. They left. Daniel said my name once more on the way out, at the door, in a voice that I think he intended to sound like sorrow. I closed the door behind them and turned the deadbolt. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my back against the door. And then, I will be honest about this, because the story is not useful if I'm not honest, I felt afraid. Not the cold quiet of the wedding night, not the sharp practical fear of the morning with the coffee cup, but something more physical. A trembling in my hands. The awareness of how exposed I was, how much I was holding, how many fronts I was managing simultaneously. Two people who were frightened and cornered and had already demonstrated they were willing to threaten. A legal process that still had months to run. A life I was simultaneously defending and rebuilding. I stood there for about 30 seconds. Then I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and forwarded the recording to Rachel with a message that read, They came to the apartment. Listen to all of it. Fear is information, not instruction. I had learned that, and learning it twice makes you believe it. The hearing was scheduled for the second week of January. Family Court, Cook County, 9th floor of the Daly Center. The room was smaller than I had expected. A gray rectangle with fluorescent lighting and chairs that didn't quite match. Rachel was at the table beside me, in a charcoal suit she wore for hearings she expected to win. Across the room, Daniel's attorney, a man named Forsyth, was organizing papers with the particular efficiency of someone who has been told, privately, that the case is not going well. Daniel was at that table. Kristen was not. She was not a party to the annulment proceeding itself, though what she had done had become relevant to it. She would be addressed separately, through a civil filing Rachel had prepared regarding the two extortion attempts, which we had reported to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office 3 weeks earlier. That process was moving on its own track. I want to describe how I felt sitting in that room, because I think people imagine courtrooms as dramatic. They are not particularly dramatic. They are deliberate and procedural, and the most significant moments in them often look like paperwork. What I felt was a very particular kind of calm. The kind that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the knowledge that you have done everything you could do. I had been thorough. I had been patient. I had not acted from anger, which is the thing that causes people to make mistakes in situations like this. I had acted from evidence and from preparation, and whatever happened in that room, I had been rigorous. Rachel presented the case methodically. The annulment petition was based on fraud, specifically that Daniel had represented himself at the time of marriage as a person who had ended his previous relationship, and that this representation was materially false. She entered Gary's documentation into the record, the hotel records, the parking garage footage, the time-stamped meetings. She entered the handwriting comparison establishing that the anonymous note had been written by Kristen Vaughn, who had, under the implicit claim of anonymity, attempted to inform the petitioner of facts that the respondent had concealed. That last detail was one I had thought about often. Kristen had sent the note as a power move, or an act of complicated emotion, or some combination of the two. But in doing so, she had inadvertently handed me the beginning of my case. She had created a record. People who play complex games sometimes forget that complexity cuts in multiple directions. Forsyth objected to several items of evidence and was overruled. He challenged the provenance of the hotel records and was told they had been properly obtained and authenticated. He argued that an affair prior to marriage did not necessarily constitute fraud under the relevant statutes, which was his strongest argument. And Rachel had anticipated it. She had a precedent from a 2019 Illinois appellate case that addressed misrepresentation of fidelity in the pre-marital period as grounds for voidability when it could be demonstrated that the petitioner would not have entered the marriage with full knowledge. I had not entered this marriage with full knowledge. That was the central fact. The moment things shifted, the moment I will remember when I think about that room, was when Forsyth called Daniel to make a statement. Daniel was composed when he stood. He was a composed man by nature, and in 6 years I had seen him flustered perhaps a handful of times. He was practiced at managing impressions, but Rachel asked him one question, just one, after he finished his prepared statement. "Mr. Hart, you've testified that the relationship with Ms. Vaughn ended prior to your engagement. Can you tell the court the specific date it ended?" He gave a date. October 14th. Rachel opened a folder and slid a document toward the judge. "These are parking garage records from the building at 225 North Michigan Avenue, showing Ms. Vaughn's vehicle accessing the reserved space registered to Renner and Cole Architecture on the following dates." She listed 7 dates, all of them after October 14th, the latest being 5 days before the wedding. "Mr. Hart, were you present at that location on any of these dates?" The pause lasted long enough to matter. He said he would need to check his calendar. Rachel said, "Take your time." He said he may have been there for project meetings. She said, "With Ms. Vaughn?" He said he couldn't be certain. The judge, a woman in her mid-50s named Honorable Patricia Mena, who had listened to the entire proceeding with an expression of careful attention, made a note. I watched her make it. Forsyth attempted to redirect. He and Daniel had a whispered exchange that was audible enough to be uncomfortable. When Forsyth spoke again, Daniel's answer on redirect contradicted what he had said on direct in 2 places. Small contradictions, the kind that occur when a person is improvising a revised story while simultaneously trying to maintain the frame of the original one. Honorable Patricia Mena saw it. I saw her see it. The proceeding concluded that afternoon. The judge did not rule from the bench. She never did, Rachel had told me. She always took it under advisement. But Rachel, on the steps of the Daly Center in January air cold enough to see your breath, said, "That went the way it needed to." I nodded. I looked at the plaza, at the Picasso sculpture across the way, at the ordinary Thursday afternoon crowd moving through downtown Chicago. I had been in that marriage for 4 months and 2 weeks. I had been fighting to undo it for 4 months and 1 week. That math felt, in that moment, almost funny. Almost. Honorable Patricia Mena issued her ruling on a Friday morning in the last week of January, 17 days after the hearing. The marriage of Elizabeth and Daniel Hart was annulled. The language of the ruling was precise and not unkind, the way legal language often manages to be both. It found that the petitioner had established, by a preponderance of the evidence, that material misrepresentation had occurred in the period prior to the marriage ceremony, and that the petitioner would not have entered the marriage had she possessed accurate knowledge of the respondent's conduct. The annulment was granted on grounds of fraud. The marriage was declared void. Rachel sent me the ruling as a PDF attachment with a single line of text. Done. I read it 3 times at my kitchen table. Outside, the oak tree in the courtyard had been bare for 2 months. The apartment was mine. I had been the sole leaseholder, and Daniel had moved out in November at Rachel's insistence, citing the pending legal proceedings. The brick wall in the living room was still there. The kitchen still looked out at the courtyard. The life I had assembled piece by piece was still, substantially, here. I had kept what was mine. More than that, I had protected it. The financial picture was clean. Because I had moved methodically and early, my individual assets were fully intact. The pre-marital investment portfolio, under my sole trust, was untouched. The joint accounts, which had contained relatively modest amounts, had been dissolved as part of the settlement agreement Rachel had negotiated. I received the full balance, which was fair given that the deposits had been primarily mine. Daniel received nothing from my pre-marital holdings, legally and properly, because the annulment meant there was no marital estate to divide. Under Illinois law, we were treated as though we had never been married. We had never been married. That was the finding. That was, in its way, the most clarifying thing the court could have said. Daniel's professional situation was more complicated than I had planned for, though not in a way I had engineered. The contradiction he had made on the stand, the dates, the parking records, the visible improvisation, had been noticed by more than just the judge. Family court proceedings are not sealed in Illinois. Forsyth, it emerged, had told Daniel's partners at Renner and Cole about the case in broad terms, which is how firms protect themselves from surprise. When the annulment was granted on fraud grounds, the story moved through professional networks the way these stories do in a city the size of Chicago, which is to say, quickly. I was not responsible for that. I had not called anyone. I had not shared the ruling except with my family and my immediate support circle. But Daniel worked in a field where reputation and client trust were foundational, and a public fraud finding, even in a family court context, was not something that stayed private. By late February, he had resigned from Renner and Cole. By March, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he had taken a position at a smaller firm in Indianapolis. He left Chicago. That was not something I had sought. But I will not pretend it was not a relief. Kristen's situation was handled through a separate civil process. The 2 extortion attempts, the October phone call and the December apartment visit, both recorded, both documented, were the foundation of a civil harassment and extortion claim that Rachel filed in parallel with the annulment. Kristen's attorney negotiated a settlement that included a formal cease and desist, financial damages paid to me, and, at my specific insistence, a written acknowledgement of conduct. She did not admit to extortion in the legal sense her attorney saw to that, but the acknowledgement was specific enough to be meaningful. She had also, by then, been terminated from Renner and Cole. This had happened in November, before the hearing, when the firm's HR department conducted a review following the disclosure that she had attended a client's wedding without an invitation and sent an anonymous note to the client's spouse. It was a clear professional boundary violation, documented and actionable. They let her go quietly, with a severance package and a non-disparagement agreement that ran both directions. She did not sue. The compliance review question, the thing she had held over me, resolved entirely on its own merits. My firm's compliance department had reviewed the transaction in question 18 months earlier and found nothing actionable. I had a clean record. The journalist contact Kristen had mentioned at my apartment never materialized because there was nothing to materialize. She had been bluffing. People who bluff in high-stakes situations are usually working with less than they claim. In late February, I sat in Carol's office for what turned out to be one of our last sessions before I reduced frequency. I told her that the ruling had come through, that the financial picture was stable, that I was sleeping normally and eating normally and had gone back to the gym. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "Like I'm standing on solid ground," I said, which I didn't realize I'd missed until I felt it again. She nodded. She said that was one of the better answers she'd heard. I drove home through Chicago in the February cold, across the river, up through Lincoln Park. I parked and walked to the apartment and turned the key in the lock and stepped inside. The brick wall, the oak tree, the kitchen, mine. Spring came early that year, or so it felt. Though Chicago springs are never really early, they're just occasionally honest about arriving. By April, I had given notice on the Lincoln Park apartment and put a deposit on a place in Andersonville, a 2-bedroom on a quiet street 3 blocks from the lake. The new apartment had large windows and wood floors and a kitchen that I chose without compromise, the way I had never quite chosen anything when I was choosing for two. I painted the living room a deep green that my mother said was too dark, and that turned out to be exactly right. Work had continued through all of it because work does. I had told my supervisor, my closest colleague, and the head of HR about the proceedings, briefly, factually, so that they were not caught off guard if anything surfaced. Nothing did. My record was clean, my performance had not deteriorated, and in March, I was offered a senior position on the portfolio management team that I had been working toward for 3 years. I took it without hesitation. There were good days and harder days. I am not interested in describing my recovery as linear because it wasn't. There were evenings when I sat in the new apartment with the green walls and felt the specific sadness of a life that had been redirected, of years that had been spent building something that turned out to be built on false ground. I did not punish myself for those feelings. Carol had been very clear about that. Grief is not the same as defeat. You can grieve what you wanted something to be while simultaneously knowing that letting it go was correct. I kept my Thursday dinners with Dana. I started a hiking group with 2 women from my building that met on Saturday mornings and ranged from the lakefront path to the forest preserves depending on the weather. My mother came for dinner every other Sunday, and she met the new apartment in May and said the green walls might actually be growing on her. In June, I had dinner with a man named Patrick, who was a friend of a friend, a civil engineer, quiet and dry-humored. Someone who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. We had dinner 3 times over the summer. Nothing rushed, nothing assumed. Just 2 people getting to know each other carefully, which felt, after everything, like exactly the right speed. I did not go looking for happiness in the year after the annulment. I went looking for stability and honesty and a life I could trust. And what I found was that when you build those things carefully, happiness tends to follow as a consequence rather than a destination. That was not a lesson I had expected, but it turned out to be one of the more useful ones. As for Daniel and Kristen, I want to be accurate about this because I am not someone who took pleasure in their outcomes, and I don't intend to perform satisfaction I did not feel. What I knew through the ordinary channels of a city where professional networks overlap was this. Daniel had relocated to Indianapolis and taken a position at a smaller firm. He was rebuilding in the way that people rebuild when they have made significant mistakes and the consequences have arrived. Whether his life there was good or bad, I genuinely did not know, and after a certain point, I stopped caring enough to find out. He was not my concern anymore. He was the concern of his own life. Kristen had a harder road. The termination from Renner and Cole, in an industry where reputation and reference letters are foundational, had material consequences. She had been a rising associate architect with real ability. Gary's research had turned up work she'd done that was technically impressive. And the combination of the termination and the civil settlement made her next position difficult to obtain. I heard, secondhand and unreliably, that she had returned to her home state and was rebuilding her licensure and career from a more modest starting point. I hope, with genuine honesty, that both of them eventually build lives they can be at peace in, not because I forgave what they did in any simple sense. What they did was a real harm, and I will not minimize it. But because the alternative, holding ongoing anger toward people who are no longer part of my life, is an enormous expenditure of energy for zero return, and I am someone who understands the mathematics of return on investment. I let it go, not all at once, but I let it go. By the time the oak tree in the old courtyard would have been going green again, I was living somewhere else, looking at different windows and finding, with some regularity and growing ease, that I was glad to be exactly where I was. That felt like enough. That felt, actually, like quite a lot. If this story has taught me anything, it is this: the most dangerous moment is not when you discover the truth. It is the moment just before, when the doubt is present and the evidence is not yet in hand, and it is so much easier to smooth things down and keep moving forward. I almost did that. I almost let the note stay crumpled in my clutch and dissolve into the noise of the evening. What saved me was not courage exactly. It was precision, the willingness to look at what was actually in front of me rather than what I wanted to see. Know your value before someone else decides it for you. Protect what you have built. Find the people who will sit with you on a porch in November and tell you the truth. And never, ever let fear be the reason you stop asking the right questions. So I want to ask you something now. If you had been standing in that reception hall, if a stranger had pressed that note into your hand on your wedding day, what would you have done? Would you have crumpled it and smiled? Or would you have started looking for the truth? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments. This kind of story only means something when it's shared. And if this reached you, if any part of it felt familiar or useful or honest, then please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. I mean that.